The Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, Transportation will come to order. Today we're having an executive session on a number of items, I think 12 different items here. I want to first start by thanking our teams on both sides who've worked very hard on this markup, Nikki Tushel, Dave Stewart, and Melissa Porter among some of the team, and thank the rest of the team for working so hard to get us where we are today on these important bills that are sponsored by various members, as well as Coast Guard nominations. First, I want to thank Senator Klobuchar and Senator Thune for their work on the bipartisan Open Ocean Shipping Reform Act. I know for me, the growers in my state are wondering how successful this season is going to be, because even if the crop yield is high, increased shipping costs and long shipping delays threaten Washington's farmers and their ability to get goods to market and make ends meet. Anderson Hay and Grain is based in Ellensburg in central Washington, and they've built an international business over the past 60 years. They've been exporting hay since 1970s to Japan. Their CEO, Mark Anderson, told me, quote, "The agriculture economy in our region does not work if we don't have competitive access to world markets," end quote. And right now the supply chain isn't working, and that's hurting American exporters trying to get hay, milk, apples, wheat to the global markets. And it's also hurting consumers here at home who are seeing higher prices on everyday products. During 2021, there was a 24% drop in full containers being exported from the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. That drop increased to 30% in January and February of this year. That means our exports are being left at the dock. The Washington Potato Commission reported they had 11% decrease in their exports from 2020 from 2019, and according to Dairy Gold, American dairy producers lost $1.5 billion last year due to port congestion and related challenges. I want to thank the Biden administration for their pop-up ag sites, which are allowing agriculture growers to pre-position their products on the docks so they won't be left behind. It's an innovative tool, and we're happy to participate with the USDA deputy, and thank USDA Administrator Vilsack for his leadership on this issue as well. We also here in the committee know that these shipping companies have been making record profits. They have made $150 billion in profits in 2021, and the ocean import volume for the first quarter of the year is forecasted to increase by more than 30%. So our farmers don't want special treatment. They just don't want to be exploited for the sake of these record profits. We know that according to a September 2020 freight index, that the container charge went from $1,300 a container to $11,000 a container. And these are exorbitant fees. And I think we need to have an Federal Maritime Commission that are looking at these issues. We see these other issues in other aspects of our committee, and hopefully we'll deal with them in the future. But right now, we need to take action on this important legislation. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act helps the Federal Maritime Commission, which is in charge of protecting the interests of U.S. shippers. The Commission has broad authority to oversee the practices of ports and terminal operators as well as carriers. For example, in May 2020, the Commission issued a rule to clarify what is reasonable for daily fee charges by carriers for boxes stored at ports. That rule on detention and demurrage is an improvement, but it has not been fully realized due to the challenges in accessing actionable and enforceable information from the large foreign carriers. That is what changes in the underlying bill by our colleagues, Senator Klobuchar and Thune. This bill strengthens the Commission's authority regarding these daily fees called detention and demurrage by shifting the burden of proof from shippers to the carriers. It requires the Commission to determine what fees are unreasonable so that we can crack down on the extra costs that are facing our farmers and growers. Our substitute amendment raises the bar even further by requiring ocean carriers to submit additional detailed data and cost information to the Commission to certify that they are complying with the law in each and every time and for what they are charging shippers for detention and demurrage. Having that information at the Commission's fingertip will help us boost enforcement and cut down on extraneous fees and charges. And the bill includes 2 additional rulemakings to strengthen the Commission's authority. First, the bill would prohibit ocean carriers from unreasonably declining U.S. cargo. This is the top ask by the American exporters whose products have been left on the docks. Second, the bill would amend the prohibitions in the Shipping Act to make it unlawful to retaliate against shippers or even threaten the denial of American cargo. As we tried to strengthen this bill in committee, I could already tell that some of these companies were definitely threatening retaliation on growers. So I hope that by the time we get to the floor, with the help of our colleagues here, we can strengthen this bill even more. As the pandemic-related supply chain challenges unfolded, it became crystal clear that the Commission lacked the resources and tool to enforce U.S. law and keep our exporters and importers competitive, and that is why the substitute also addresses the resources that are needed at the Commission. So again, I want to thank Senator Klobuchar-Thune for working on this important issue and encourage my colleagues to vote for this legislation. Also on today's agenda is the Duckworth legislation, the Martha Wright Reed Just and Reasonable Act, and I thank her for her leadership. The Next Generation Telecom Act, which is co-sponsored by Senators Cortez Masto, Wicker, Thune, Lujan, that would create Next Generation Telecom Council to advise on 5G. Also, Senator Wicker's Freight Act, and I appreciate his willingness to work with us. We've been able to, I think, improve that legislation, and I plan to join him as a co-sponsor. Next, we have legislation from Senators Rosen and Cornyn, the TSA Reaching Across Nationalities, Societies, and Language to Advance Travel Act, and appreciate their support. The Blunt, Wyden, Klobuchar-Fisher bill on Low Power Protection Act, and the legislation by Senators Peter and Capito strengthening support for American Manufacturing Act. A GAO report identified 58 programs across 11 agencies that support manufacturing and strengthening them, and a preventing PSA runoff at airports by Peters, Moran, Klobuchar, Duckworth, Capito, and Lummis, and the Right-Whale Coexistence Act of 2022 by Senators Booker, Carper, Blumenthal, and Whitehouse. And finally, I think Senator Wicker's FAA Leadership Status Act that would amend the U.S. Code to eliminate restrictions on retired military service members to serve both at the FAA and deputy positions. I'm sorry, forgot the Forecasting Act by Senator Wicker's been very busy on this markup. You're not going anywhere, are you? Anyway, my point is this is a very important legislation. NOAA needs to have more ability. We see how weather is impacting us all the time. So this Forecasting Improvement Act of 2017 to update on current tornado rating and systems, I think will help us improve communications to the public. Now I'll turn to Senator Wicker for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Senator Cantwell. I'm pleased to support these important bipartisan bills before us today. I'll mention a few of the agenda items. First, let me thank the chair and her staff for working with me on the Tornado Act. In my state of Mississippi, tornadoes are particularly deadly because they often strike at night, in the rain, and are hidden by woods and forests. In recent months, devastating tornadoes have taken lives across the country. These deadly outbreaks have shown that even when tornadoes are well forecasted, lead times and warnings do not always ensure that the public can adequately respond or that appropriate shelter is available. This very day, Madam Chair, the National Weather Service has predicted severe storms for my state of Mississippi, including tornadoes. This highlights the importance of marking up this legislation now. The Tornado Act would require that NOAA work to improve hazardous weather communications and forecasting to help prevent the loss of life and property in future storms. Today's agenda also includes important legislation to address ongoing supply chain issues. 2 years into the pandemic, Americans continue to feel the impacts of these disruptions on our economy. To help address these issues, I introduced the Freight Act, along with Senators Capito, Moran, Young, Blackburn, Thune, and Sullivan, and I'm pleased to see it on today's markup. The Freight Act would improve our freight transportation system by streamlining the licensing process for truck drivers, addressing unlawful shipping conduct, and providing oversight of transportation operations. In addition, I want to applaud Senators Klobuchar and Thune for bringing forward the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. This legislation would give Federal Maritime Commission stronger rulemaking authority to help protect American shippers, in particular ag exporters. I appreciate the collaboration between Senators Cantwell, Klobuchar, and Thune on the substitute amendment, which will strengthen the bill to help address critical ocean shipping supply chain issues. I would like to have seen Senator Blackburn's Improving Memphis Supply Chain Act on today's markup. As a major inland intermodal hub for marine containers, Memphis needs to be able to operate more efficiently in our nation's interconnected freight system, and this legislation would help Memphis serve as a model for enhancing intermodal efficiency. I hope we can still find a way to move forward on this legislation. And lastly, my bipartisan Next Generation Telecommunications Act is on the agenda for consideration. This bill would establish a council of experts tasked with developing a strategy to advance American leadership in 6G and beyond. It is critical that the U.S. maintain its role as a leader in deploying secure, innovative, and high-quality networks, not just for the economic benefits these networks bring, but to keep the U.S. globally competitive. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize, since the major bill we're marking up is Senator Klobuchar's, to make a statement on that legislation.
Thank you. I'll be brief because I believe we have a quorum. I want to thank you, Senator Cantwell, as well as Senator Wicker, for your hard work with us on this bill, as well as my friend, Senator Thune. I want to take a moment to thank our 27 co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, including 10 other members of this committee. That would be Baldwin, Peters, Moran, Blumenthal, Young, Blackburn, Warnock, Blunt, Fisher, and Hickenlooper, and I know many others support it. We all know that we have a major problem here when the shipping industry made a record 190 billion profits in 2021, a seven-fold increase from the previous year. And these are foreign ocean carriers. U.S. exporters, our businesses in our own country, have been slapped with higher fees, have not been able to export their goods because empty containers are going back. And we want to be a country that makes stuff, invents things, and exports to the world. That means having the ability to export things to the world and not just have things come into our own country. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act goes a long way toward giving the Federal Maritime Commission greater authority to issue a rule prohibiting international ocean carriers from unreasonably declining shipping opportunities and make sure we have better prices. I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank you especially, Senator Wicker, for adding a number of provisions from your Freight Act, and it's a much better bill because of that. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to recognize Senator Wicker for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S 3785, the FAA Leadership Veterans Status Act, be favorably reported.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. Now, Senator Wicker is recognized for further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S 1541, the Martha Wright Reed Just and Reasonable Communications Act of 2021, as amended by the Duckworth substitute, S 3014, the Next Generation Telecommunications Act, as amended by the Wicker-Lujan substitute, Lee 1, Lee 3, Lee 5 as modified, and Scott 2 as modified. S 3296, the TSA Translate Act, as amended by Lujan 1 and Lee 1. S 3405, the Low Power Protection Act, as amended by Lee 1. S 3434, the Strengthening Support for American Manufacturing Act, as modified by the Peters substitute. S 3662, the Preventing PFAS Runoff at Airports Act, as amended by the Peters substitute and Lee 1 as modified. S 3664, the Right Whale Coexistence Act of 2022 as modified by the Blumenthal substitute, Markey 3, and Lee 2 as modified, and S 3817, the Tornado Act, as amended by the Wicker substitute as modified, be favorably reported.
Is there a second? Is there a comment, Senator Baldwin? Did you want to make a comment now, or should we go through the rest of the mark? I'm sorry, Senator Duckworth. Sorry, I got my Tammys confused here. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to thank the National Sheriff's Association for working so hard with me on the Martha Wright Just and Reasonable Communications Act. It was a multi-year process, and they let me through the door, and we had some long conversations. And I also want to thank the ranking member for his help in all of this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments on those, this motion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The motion is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I'd like to be recognized as a no on 3664.
So noted. I recognize Senator Wicker for a further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that the Coast Guard promotions in PN 1827 and PN 1828 be favorably reported.
Is there a second? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. I recognize Senator Wicker for a further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S 3580, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, as amended by the Cantwell substitute as modified, co-sponsored by Senators Wicker, Klobuchar, and Thune, Blackburn 2, Blackburn 3 as modified, Cruz 4 as modified, Cruz 5 as modified, Johnson 1 as modified, Lee 2, Lee 10 as modified, Lee 15, Lee 21 as modified, Johnson 1 as modified, and Lee 22 as modified be favorably reported.
Is there a second?
Second.
All, any discussion or debate?
Madam Chair.
Yes. Senator Cruz.
Madam Chair, I have two amendments on this bill that I'd like to call up.
Go ahead, Senator Cruz.
I'd like to call up Cruz Amendment 1. This amendment is aimed at reducing the needlessly high prices that Americans are currently paying to power and to heat their homes, and eliminating the dangerous dependence that multiple American regions have on foreign natural gas, and especially on Russian natural gas, and also on strengthening the relationships between the United States and our closest allies. Right now, it is easier for the state of Hawaii to get energy from Asia than it is from Alaska. It's easier for Puerto Rico to get natural gas from Trinidad than from Texas. And right now, it is substantially easier for Boston, Massachusetts to get LNG from Russia than from the Sabine Pass in Texas. And that is the case right now, and I think it's pretty obvious we have an energy distribution problem. If the recent crisis with Russia and Ukraine and the dominance of Russia over European energy has shown us anything, it's that we need to be as self-reliant as possible when it comes to energy, and to use our energy to help our allies to the greatest degree possible. Current U.S. law, the Jones Act, allows foreign vessels to enter U.S. ports to sell their country's natural gas, and they do at great quantity. But it prevents U.S. companies from shipping their natural gas from one U.S. port to another unless that vessel was built, flagged, or at least 75% crude in the United States. The current law penalizes U.S. producers who have no control whatsoever over the types of vessels that ship LNG. It also penalizes consumers, particularly in Northeast states, who pay on average 50% more for natural gas than the rest of the country, or Puerto Rico, which pays twice as much as the rest of the country. In the winter of 2018, consumers in the state of Massachusetts paid 450% more than those in Texas and Louisiana. All of this could have been avoided had these consumers been able to buy American-produced gas. Under the proposed amendment, companies may apply for a temporary waiver if they can prove that there are no available vessels to deliver their LNG. Once there's an available Jones Act ship, the waiver goes away. And it's worth noting, out of the world's 478 ships currently dedicated to transporting LNG, none, zero, meet the Jones Act requirements. So exporting LNG from the U.S. mainland to Puerto Rico, to Hawaii, or even from one mainland city to the other is impossible right now. I recognize a number of members of this committee are committed to the Jones Act, and I understand that interest. But right now, all of the LNG coming in is coming in on foreign ships. It's not coming in on Jones Act ships. So the only question is, do we want it to be American natural gas or Russian natural gas? A vote no on this amendment will be a vote to keep America more dependent on foreign energy. It will be a vote to destroy jobs here at home. And it will be a vote for American energy consumers to pay much, much more. In the case of the state of Massachusetts, up to 450% more for energy than they could if they were simply allowed to purchase American energy. This is a common sense amendment that protects jobs, that lowers energy prices, and that responds to the war in Europe by replacing foreign natural gas with American natural gas, and I urge its adoption.
I thank the senator for his amendment 3580. I do not support it. I don't think we need a new or an end run around the Jones Act waiver process. There is a very well-established process in law now to allow waivers when an emergency or national security is at stake. The required evaluation can be completed very quickly in case of a true emergency, and there are no indications that the Jones Act waiver is needed to solve the supply chain crisis or access to LNG. 20 administrative Jones Act waivers have been issued over the past 5 years for true national emergencies. That includes 2 during the Colonial Pipeline emergency, 11 during Hurricane Maria and Irma in 2017, so the process works. Additional legislative loopholes only weaken the law that protects the U.S. maritime industry, one that I think we, after looking at supply chain issues, need to strengthen. 650,000 American jobs, and they contribute more than $15 billion to the national economy, but because we have the Jones Act. The Jones Act protects our national and economic security, ensuring we have a strong merchant marine and shipbuilding industry. So I'd ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Madam Chair,
Senator Wicker.
I too oppose this amendment. And I think the author will agree with me that his amendment actually doesn't address the root cause. I think that Senator Cruz and I would agree that actually the United States is the Saudi Arabia of the world in natural gas, and it is decisions made by the Biden administration that have essentially stopped LNG by rail, and also some decisions by various states to oppose the production. So I think at least he and I will agree that this would not get at the root cause. But as the chair has said, there is already a waiver process. The waiver process under the Cruz Amendment would require discretion by the administration, just as we currently have now. And then finally, I do believe the Cruz Amendment would undermine the Jones Act and the American shipbuilding industry and their workers. If this sort of amendment had been in place for the last decade, there are 19 oil tankers and 23 barges made by Americans, by American workers, for Americans, that would not ever have been built. So while I think that the senator and I agree on the basics that our natural gas policy is wrong-headed in the United States, I do not believe this amendment would be helpful. As a matter of fact, would be harmful to American jobs and American security.
Madam Chair, if I could respond to the comments made, I would say 2 things. Number one, the argument that this would somehow undermine the Jones Act, I think is objectively false. As I mentioned, of the 478 ships dedicated to transporting LNG, 0 are compliant with the Jones Act. So if you're asking, I understand there are members on both sides of the aisle that are strong supporters of the Jones Act that want to see the U.S. maritime industry, want to see ships built here. It is objectively correct that this is not succeeding with LNG. There are 0 ships. The senator from Mississippi said, well, gosh, if this amendment had been the law, we wouldn't see the oil tankers and bargers. With respect, that is incorrect. This doesn't apply to oil tankers and barges. It applies to liquid natural gas, a very specialized transportation, so it would have had 0 impact on those ships. So right now, the Jones Act, with regard to LNG transport, is producing 0 jobs. There are no shipbuilding jobs, there's no crew jobs, because there are no ships. And nobody thinks there are going to be any ships anytime soon. So there is no affirmative benefit for any shipbuilder, for any American crew, to saying we will only allow foreign LNG transports to come in, because that's the effect of voting no, is you're going to say we're going to let all the foreign ships in, but we don't want, the foreign ships can only carry foreign LNG, not American natural gas. That's the effect of no. And I would say, secondly, both the chairman and ranking member have pointed to the waiver process. It is true there's a waiver process for things like emergencies, like the Colonial Pipeline. You know what's not deemed an emergency? The fact that the people of Puerto Rico pay twice as much for energy as people in the mainland. You know what's not deemed an emergency? The fact that people in the Northeast are paying 50% more for energy to heat their homes than the rest of the country. You know what's not deemed an emergency? The fact that people in Massachusetts in 2018 paid 450% more to heat their homes than Texas and Louisiana. That's not deemed an emergency, and anyone who votes no is saying to those consumers, tough luck, there will be no solution. You're going to continue to have to import foreign natural gas because we are voting to say you are not allowed to import American natural gas. It's hurting consumers, and it's hurting our national security, and it's not benefiting a job. It hasn't produced even a single Jones Act ship in the entire time it's been in place. And by the way, if it did, let's say tomorrow magically a Jones Act ship was built, that the an American shipyard decided to produce a Jones Act ship, this waiver doesn't apply then. The instant there's an American ship, that American ship gets the contract. So the waiver only applies if there are no ships available. So a no vote is saying, even though there are no ships, we want it to be illegal for you to purchase American natural gas. I got to say, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, Senator, you remind me of the time that the Energy Committee had the same hearing, and a very large Wall Street interest of home heating oil tried to make the same point about the fact that Northeast home heating oil was higher because of the Jones Act. And when I pointed out to him that his company had been fined for manipulating those prices, then he kind of stepped back a second. So I think there's lots of issues here that we're talking about. I don't think the Jones Act is going to, a waiver of the Jones Act will solve our problems. But hopefully we'll have the oil companies' executives here soon, and we can talk about all these issues about what's causing the problem. Further discussion? If not, would the senator like a roll call vote? Yes. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Mr. Schatz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema?
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan?
No by proxy.
Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Wicker?
No.
Mr. Thune?
No.
Mr. Blunt?
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Sullivan?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
No by proxy.
Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Johnson? No. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Scott? No. Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 26, the yeses are 2.
The amendment is not agreed to. Further
Madam Chair.
amendments? Yes, Senator Cruz.
Madam Chair, I will call up Cruise 2. Cruise 2 is similar to Cruise 1, but in addition to LNG, it adds a limited waiver for offshore construction, including wind installations. So right now, our Democratic colleagues give speeches at great volume about the need to develop more wind. Now, the number one producer of wind in the entire country is the great state of Texas. One of the major impediments to building wind installations offshore is the lack of Jones Act compliant ships available to do so. So our Democratic colleagues have a choice. If they in fact believe we have a climate emergency, if they in fact believe we should see more wind energy, if they in fact believe we should not be reliant on Russian natural gas and foreign natural gas, this is a natural opportunity to say, let's remove the regulatory barriers to, number one, reducing the energy cost for major portions of this country, but number two, to developing more wind. And if we vote no, then our Democratic colleagues and indeed our Republican colleagues will be saying that we're not interested in more wind being developed, even though there is no evidence that even a single ship is being built under the Jones Act for this. So there's no upside. There's no job that's being created. But it's a choice. Do we want to waiver to allow low-cost American energy, or do we want to remain reliant on energy produced by our enemies? And do we want to facilitate the production of alternative forms of energy, including especially wind?
Speaking to the Cruz amendment, as I said earlier, I think we should be considering ways to strengthen U.S. flag vessels and our maritime workforce, not trying to undermine it. I think that's what this international situation is reminding us of. And as I said, it protects 650,000 jobs that are high-wage jobs. The first major qualified wind turbine installation vessel is being constructed in Brownsville, Texas, creating thousands of American jobs. And as our nation is building its offshore wind energy industry, it makes no sense to outsource American vessels and American mariner jobs to foreign companies and foreign workers. In a time when our offshore wind energy is taking off on the East Coast, the Jones Act is working. Certain heavy lift needs do not require a Jones Act vessel, but other wind energy development work, including support vessels, is done by the U.S. flagged vessels, U.S. crews in support of coastal economies all along New England and mid-Atlantic. Texas, too, is benefiting from the offshore wind and the Jones Act. The first major qualified wind turbine installation vessel is being constructed, as I said, in Brownsville, Texas, creating thousands of American jobs, and our nation is building its offshore wind industry. I believe it doesn't make sense to outsource American vessels and American jobs for mariners that could be done right here at home. We do not need an end run on the Jones Act, and I urge my colleagues to turn this down.
Senator Cantwell, if I could add, nearly all of this is caused by the fact that we have these 4 shipping alliances that are foreign-owned. And this end around of the Jones Act isn't going to fix that. And what we're trying to do here with the bill, if you just step back from the amendments with the bill, is to get our country to be able to have more control over shipping and exporting and making things in America. Because right now, whether it is the semiconductor issue that you and others have been working on for months now, or whether it is other manufacturing as became apparent during the pandemic, we've got to make things in this country again and have some control over what's happening with our shipping. And I don't think the answer is to turn more things over to foreign governments and alliances and companies.
Further discussion? Would you like a roll call vote? Yes. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Mr. Schatz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters?
No.
Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth?
No.
Mr. Tester? Nay. Ms. Sinema?
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan?
No by proxy.
Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Wicker?
No.
Mr. Thune?
No.
Mr. Blunt?
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz? Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Moran? Mr. Sullivan?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
No by proxy.
Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Johnson? Mrs. Capito? Mr. Scott? Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 26, the yeses are 2.
Madam Chair, I'd like to call up my amendment. Lee number 17 is modified.
Go ahead, Senator Lee.
While the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically increased e-commerce sales. The surge of online goods has exposed some problems, some systemic problems with our supply chain, introducing truck shortages, port capacity, and technology, as well as port labor challenges. Americans in all states, and not just in the coastal ones, are experiencing consumer product shortages. And the end doesn't really appear to be anywhere nearly in sight. Businesses, particularly small ones, are feeling the supply chain crunch. Unfortunately, to continue to serve their customers and employ their workforce, they've had no other choice but to increase consumer prices, further contributing to our broader inflationary pressures. I introduced a bill called the Stop the Grinch Act late last year and recently introduced an updated version of it called the Ship It Act in order to provide temporary relief measures to ease pressures experienced by carriers, ports, truckers, rail lines, and others along the supply chain, ultimately affecting consumers. I appreciate the chair's willingness and that of Senator Wicker to work with me to incorporate some of these reforms into the bill, which we've done. But I think we can still do more, and that's why I'm offering this amendment today. Lee Amendment 17 is modified, which would provide additional space for the overflow storage of cargo containers. If you can forget the images of vessels anchored off our coast, just waiting to unload, one reason the wait is so long is because we don't have enough dock space to place the containers. To make matters worse, if the containers aren't sitting on the ship or at the shipyard, they're sitting on our previous supply on our precious but sometimes dwindling supply of truck chassis, which are so desperately needed for the transportation of goods throughout the country. So my amendment requires that the GSA, the Secretaries of Agriculture, Interior, Transportation, and Defense jointly consult major stakeholders in our supply chain, ocean carriers, ports, railroads, and truckers, to identify and temporarily designate plots of federal land that we can use to store empty containers for no more than a year. Because this authority is for such a short period of time and for such a unique emergency purpose, my amendment creates a categorical exclusion from NEPA. But I want to be clear. The locations of these lands are in the discretion of the agency heads and consistent with the Council on Environmental Quality's NEPA regulations, meaning that if a designation is determined to have extraordinary circumstances that warrant the preparation of environmental documents, then the agency head must do so, not only may, but must do so in accordance with NEPA. This is not a blanket waiver of NEPA. It's only a presumptive one that can be waived easily. This overflow storage will provide a much-needed temporary relief valve to offload containers and help free up dock space so that we can unload our ships and have more efficient thoroughfare of cargo. Some projections note that our supply chain crisis could go on for another 12 to 18 months. Congress really should act now. It must act now to provide common sense measures like that found in my amendment. Lee Amendment 17 is modified to help mitigate the worst of our supply chain crisis for the benefit of all Americans. I'm proud to have the support of the Association of Port Authorities on this amendment, and I ask for the support of each of my colleagues, and I'd like a roll call vote on this.
Thank you, Senator Lee. I certainly support securing more space for our ports. I think one of the issues that we found is that the pop-up space that the Biden-Harris administration just announced through Secretary Vilsack is a very positive solution. I think this amendment, though, misses the mark in a couple of ways. The amendment would require federal agencies to identify federal lands within 14 days, which certainly bypasses a thoughtful review. The amendment would also fail to allow public-private partnerships, which is the success, really, of the Biden-Harris pop-up ports issue, including the pop-up port that was just announced last week in Seattle, which I participated with many of our growers from the state on what a positive solution that was, because you're pre-positioning the product very, very close. The problem is the ships are leaving, they're giving farmers very little notice, so they have to be pre-positioned very close at hand. Our hay, our apple, our potato farmers, our dairy producers have struggled with the narrow and unpredictable shipping windows and the U.S. impact of having their product left at the port. So the pop-up solution, very close to the port in pre-positioning, proximity to the major export terminal, has been a very positive step. I've heard from farmers that the benefit of the pop-up is also the fact that it's so close to the export terminal. This amendment looks to direct the administration to establish container storage sites 150 miles away. Part of the issue is that they're saying we need to be close at hand. I'm also concerned that bypassing important security and safety laws that keep our ports and port workers' safety under the Maritime Transportation Security Act, workforce and equipment are needed to make these pop-up ports functional, and it is unlikely that the railroads have access to the federal land, which would be explored under this amendment. Containers would be needed to be moved by the port to the temporary facility and back by truck. I can tell you right now, this committee has got to get our mind around what we're going to do to increase trucking capacity. We don't have enough drivers. We have congestions on our streets and highways. That's why I'm so happy we passed our major port infrastructure investment, because we got to improve all of this. I believe in the trade economy, but we have to improve our infrastructure if we're going to get our products to and from. So the amendment would direct multiple federal agencies to explore potential containers on federal lands. I believe would irresponsibly allow for the categorical exclusion of NEPA, exposing environment and fisheries and recreation to potential hazards, and potentially in areas where we don't want to see this development. So let's continue on the smart innovation solutions that the pop-up ports the Biden-Harris administration has established, and get this product closer to the export containers so that they can leave our docks in a timely fashion. I oppose the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Senator Wicker.
I support the amendment, and I think the senator from Utah would say we already have these temporary pop-up facilities in Savannah and Oakland, and now we understand from my distinguished friend in the state of Washington. This amendment simply directs the agencies to work together to look at additional temporary container overflow storage areas, and I cannot understand why this wouldn't be agreed to by a voice vote. So I will vote yes.
Further discussion? If not, clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Schatz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? Ms. Sinema?
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan?
No by proxy.
Mr. Hickenlooper? Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Wicker?
Yes.
Mr. Thune? Yes. Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Yes. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Ms. Lummis?
And aye by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
The amendment is not agreed to. Senator
Cantwell.
Scott, did you want? Yes, Senator Scott.
Chair Cantwell, I'd like to call up Scott 1.
Go ahead, Senator Scott.
It will require an annual report and testimony on supply chains from the Secretaries of Transportation and Commerce. First, I want to commend my colleagues for their work on the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and I support the provisions in the bill that will bring more transparency to the shipping process. But this is just one piece of the puzzle. The supply chain crisis Americans are feeling today has been a culmination of the COVID-19 pandemic, massive, reckless government spending, paying people more to stay home than to go to work, unnecessary mandates, raging inflation and gas prices, and burdensome regulations on business owners. Many of these wounds are self-inflicted from this administration. I have an outstanding request with this committee for us to receive public testimony from Commerce Secretary Raimondo and Transportation Secretary Buttigieg about the supply chain crisis and what the Biden administration is doing to fix it. Every month when I see the Biden administration's new inflation numbers come out, they're always worse than the month before. For months, we've seen the devastating impacts that Biden's administration's raging inflation and supply chain crisis have on American families and businesses all across this nation. Store shelves are empty, small businesses can't access the basic goods and products they need to serve Americans, and prices are surging out of control. America has seen inflation at a 40-year high, and this supply chain crisis is only making this problem even worse. And we all see it's hurting many hardworking Americans' families like mine growing up who are having to make a choice: fill up their gas tank, heat their home, or put food on the table. Restoring our supply chains is critical, getting the American economy rolling again, and we cannot wait to act. It's past time the American public and this committee hear directly and publicly from the Biden administration. Chair Cantwell, I hope we can find an appropriate time in the near future for Secretary Raimondo and Secretary Buttigieg to come before the Commerce Committee. Today, I'll withdraw this amendment, and I look forward to continuing to work with the chair so this committee can hear directly from these secretaries.
I thank the senator, and I agree. I appreciate your efforts. I think transparency on what we're all doing on supply chain is going to be really important. I recognize Senator Wicker if there's no other members who'd like to be recognized. On the Freight Act, page 13 of 16.
Don't we need to pass the bill?
Yeah, we need to pass the bill. We should pass the bill.
Okay, are there any further amendments to this bill? Seeing none, now is the passage of 3580 as amendment. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. Now I recognize Senator Wicker for a motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S 3262, the Freight Act as amended by Wicker 1 as modified, and Scott 1 to Wicker 1 as modified, be favorably reported.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion or debate?
Madam Chair.
Senator Cruz.
Madam Chair, I call up Cruz Amendment 1. This is yet another opportunity for the committee to address skyrocketing energy prices. And in this instance, to address it in a way that doesn't impact the Jones Act at all. More than a year after the Biden administration's executive order put the LNG by rail rule on ice, we're still no closer to having an updated rule, and we're actually further away and in the middle of an energy crisis. American families are right now paying 200% more for natural gas to heat and power their homes than this time last year. So in 1 year, those prices have doubled. And in some parts of the country, they've increased even more. In November of 2021, the Department of Transportation moved to permanently suspend authorization of transporting LNG by railroad entirely while it goes about a new rulemaking or until June 30th, 2024, whichever is sooner. Why June 2024? We have no idea. It is a deadline that is arbitrary, as was the initial decision to review LNG by rail in the first place. Opponents say LNG by rail is dangerous and we don't know enough about it, yet we transport LNG right now by truck. And we know that rail has statistically fewer incidents than roadway transportation. If you're concerned about the environment, LNG by rail is better for the environment, pollutes less, and produces less carbon than LNG by truck. So a vote no on this amendment is a vote to keep energy prices high, to pollute more, to increase carbon, and to not take meaningful steps towards our energy security and independence. I would note finally that the White House right now is fond of the talking point that the skyrocketing energy prices we're facing in this country is the result of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is responsible for a lot of bad things in the world. But the skyrocketing natural gas prices that consumers are paying right now is the result of this administration putting in place policies to hammer U.S. energy production and hammer the transportation of energy. This is a simple common sense provision that says we should be able to transport liquid natural gas, which will lower consumers' energy bills and will help the environment, will pollute less. And anyone who votes no, it's not Putin that are increasing consumers' energy bills. It is senators voting no and refusing to allow liquid natural gas to be transported so that they can heat their home with low-cost energy.
Speaking against the amendment, this amendment would prohibit the Secretary of Transportation from issuing any regulation or long-term order to prohibit transportation of liquefied natural gas by rail. This issue is incredibly important to my state and many states who see this transportation through their communities. And when you have rail that goes through every major city in your state and often through your downtown, these issues become very important. Rail cars are full of liquid natural gas. They can be vulnerable to explosive incidents that can have fatal and devastating consequences. Tragically, we learned from the derailment in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, involving a train which derailed crude oil. In that case, the explosion level of the town center, and it took 47 lives. So it's difficult to imagine, but according to the Sandia National Laboratory, LNG is 4 times as explosive as crude oil. It is clear that the safe transportation of LNG should be taken extremely seriously. The hazardous material safety experts at the Department of Transportation should be the ones to determine whether or not it is safe to transport the LNG by rail. This amendment would take away that ability to do that by forcing DOT to allow for LNG transportation by rail no matter the danger. For that reason, I oppose this amendment.
Madam Chair,
Senator Wicker.
I support the amendment. LNG is being transported through every community you mentioned in the state of Washington by truck. It is less energy efficient. If you were worried about greenhouse gas emissions, it emits less to ship them by rail. This is a simple amendment, as the senator from Texas says, has nothing to do with the Jones Act. I'm glad that we're off of that for a moment. But this is about making a clean source of heating and energy available more easily to Americans and cutting the price that consumers are paying out of the nose. It seems to me that there is no safety reason to oppose this amendment and every economic and pocketbook reason to support it.
Speaking again against the amendment, I definitely think it's very important that rail cars and the safety of rail cars meet a standard. And to me, having the secretary being unable to issue regulations regarding that doesn't seem like a great idea. So oppose the amendment.
Madam Chair.
Senator Cruz.
If I could respond briefly with 2 things. Number one, the chairman said that the Department of Transportation should evaluate the safety. Of course, the Department of Transportation did so. When it issued this rulemaking, it went through the formal process of a rulemaking. It considered the safety and issued a rule. And it was President Biden and the political appointees of this administration that reversed that rule. Secondly, the chairman, I'm sure inadvertently, misdescribed what this amendment does, because the chairman said it prevents any sort of DOT regulation on it. That's not accurate. What the amendment does is it prohibits the secretary from a long-term prohibition on the transportation of LNG, but it explicitly says in Section B of the amendment, nothing in this section may be construed to limit the authority of the Secretary of Transportation to issue short-term emergency orders related to the transportation of liquefied natural gas by rail. So there is ample authority to deal with safety issues that are genuine safety issues, but what there is not authority to do is to enter into a political decision to shut down LNG by rail because the Biden administration adamantly opposes American energy production of oil and gas. And as a consequence, gasoline prices and natural gas prices to heat your home are skyrocketing, and that is the direct and intended effect of policies put in place by Joe Biden and the political appointees in his administration. And this is now an opportunity for the members of this committee to decide whether they support higher energy prices for consumers and whether they support more pollution and more carbon emissions, because if you vote no on this amendment, you are saying that LNG should be transported by truck, should pollute more and emit more carbon because of, I suppose, a political animosity to American energy independence.
I think, Senator, it's more about whether we tried to do congressional review amendment processes in the committee on a bill or whether we let that play out with the normal process. And so I'd encourage my colleagues to vote no on this. Clerk will call the roll if no further comments.
Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Schatz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema?
No, but, sorry.
Ms.
No by
Rosen?
proxy, yeah.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan?
No by proxy.
Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Wicker?
Aye.
Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Blunt?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Lee?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Capito? Mr. Scott? Ms. Lummis?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 14.
Is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to this bill? Seeing none, the question is now on the passage of S 3262 as amended. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. Votes now have concluded, and I will now recognize any members who wish to make further remarks. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just say how pleased I am that the Commerce Committee reported the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 today with a strong bipartisan vote. Senator Klobuchar and I have worked for months in a bipartisan manner to negotiate this strong bipartisan legislation, which has nearly 30 co-sponsors in the Senate. I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for working with me on such an important piece of legislation which addresses the concerns we had expressed in a bipartisan letter just over 1 year ago today. This legislation provides the FMC with new authorities to respond to unfair ocean carrier practices, whether it's refusal to carry certain cargoes or discrimination against certain commodities for export. It also provides the FMC with tools to more quickly resolve detention and demurrage disputes, bringing greater efficiency and transparency to a process that leaves many shippers frustrated, especially small businesses. These improvements will bring long-term positive changes to the maritime supply chain, which I hope will benefit exporters, importers, and consumers alike. The current supply chain crisis has heightened the importance of addressing these challenges, and I look forward to moving this bill swiftly through committee and on to the Senate floor. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Klobuchar.
Yes, very briefly, since I already spoke, I just want to thank Senator Thune for his leadership. I don't think it's a surprise this came from the Midwest, but what I think has been incredible is the support we've gotten from our port senators as well, including Senator Cantwell, Senator Wicker, who understand how important this is for all of America and helped us to make this bill better. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. Some of us in the Midwest are port senators. Anyways, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make a couple of comments regarding the strengthening support for American Manufacturing Act, S 3434. Really appreciate the efforts that Senators Peters and Blackburn put into this legislation to improve the services that our federal manufacturing programs can provide to our nation's small manufacturers. As chair of the Manufacturing Subcommittee with jurisdiction over manufacturing, specifically the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and the Manufacturing USA programs that are mentioned in this legislation, I want to ensure that any efforts to study the reorganization of the Commerce Department's manufacturing programs are undertaken with the utmost care. While I understand the intent of the legislation is to improve the impact of our federal manufacturing support programs, I share the concerns of our Wisconsin Manufacturing Extension Partnership about the way this study is to be structured. Therefore, I hope that the bill's sponsors will be willing to work with me to address some of the concerns I have and my constituents have with this bill as it moves forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for a successful markup. And I'd like to talk on, just briefly, on two of the bills that we passed. The Freight Act, first of all. We know that ports across our country are experiencing unprecedented congestion, sending ripples all along our nation's supply chain. These ripples have resulted in delays and higher prices for goods, impacting everyday Americans. Congress took a significant step in passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which not only reflects our commitment to our nation's infrastructure, but will also make improvements and encourage efficiencies along this supply chain. These investments will take time to implement, which is why I'm proud to join my colleagues in passing the Freight Act. This important legislation will enhance appropriate government oversight of transportation operations, minimize barriers for stakeholders to address unlawful shipping conduct, streamline certification requirements for truck drivers, and incentivize the use of new technologies to improve efficiencies. I'd also like to talk about S3662, the Preventing PFAS Runoff on Airports Act. The FAA requires regular testing of firefighting equipment, which may lead to the discharge of harmful chemicals like PFAS. Specifically, the Preventing PFAS Runoff at Airports Act would benefit several airports in my state of West Virginia, like Yeager, Greenbrier, and Mid-Ohio Valley, and improve the overall safety of these operations. This bill would enable them to purchase equipment to test their airport rescue and firefighting equipment without dispersing PFAS foam. And anecdotally, I would say that the Martinsburg Air Force, where we have an air guard base, we did have an incident there with PFAS in the water that has been remediated by the city of Martinsburg, with the Department of Defense coming and helping and funding that. But it just shows you that impacts, big and small, can be impacted by this. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. I want to again thank all the members for their participation in the markup of these 12 different provisions, and to thank the staff on both sides for working diligently through those issues. Hopefully we'll continue this with more markups this month and next. With that, we're adjourned.